Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really complex and frankly challenging book, Dr. Soha's A Critique of the Quran. This is a work that asks us to do something pretty radical, to set aside a faith-based reading and instead analyze the Quran as a historical document.
Right at the beginning, the author makes this plea for impartiality. It's an invitation to approach the text not with, as they put it, love and hate, but with contemplation. And that's really the journey we're going to follow in this explainer, a critical, scholarly investigation.
So, to navigate this, here's our plan. We'll start with the author's core premise. Then we'll look at the challenge to scientific claims and the deconstruction of a so-called miracle code. After that, we'll get into textual and moral contradictions, and finally, land on the book's ultimate verdict.
Okay, let's dive in. What's the fundamental approach here? Well, the book makes it very clear that its goal isn't to attack faith. The idea is to apply what's called a historical critical method. Basically, to read the Quran not as some divine text existing outside of time, but as a book from a very specific time and place.
And this is the absolute core of the argument. Viewing the Quran as a product of its environment, the book suggests that to really understand it, you have to analyze it through the history, the language, and even the mythology that was floating around in 7th century Arabia. The central idea is that its contents were shaped by the world in which they first appeared.
So the investigation really kicks off by putting the Quran's descriptions of the natural world to the test. The author zeroes in on verses that are often held up as proof of miraculous scientific knowledge and then compares them to what people already knew back then.
Take this famous verse about embryology. You'll hear this one cited a lot as proof of scientific foreknowledge that couldn't have been known at the time. But the author asks a pretty direct question. Was this knowledge really so unique to the Quran at that point in history? And this is where the author's case gets really interesting. On the left, you see the stages from the Quran. But on the right, these are the stages described by the Greek physician Galen almost 500 years earlier. The author points out that Galen's writings were widely translated and known in the Middle East and argues that these similarities, well, they're striking. They suggest a historical link, not necessarily a divine revelation.
This timeline really puts it all into perspective. The author's point is that these ideas, whether about embryology or epic poetry, didn't just appear out of thin air. They were part of the intellectual currency of the time, accessible to the people on the Arabian Peninsula through trade routes and cultural exchange.
And the critique doesn't stop with biology. It expands to the cosmos. The book points to descriptions of the sky as a solid roof, or mountains acting as pegs to hold down a flat earth. The argument here is that these images perfectly mirror ancient pre-scientific models of the universe, rather than reflecting some kind of unique, divine insight into modern science.
Okay, next up, the book switches gears from science to math. It tackles a very different kind of claim. This popular theory that there's a secret miracle code hidden right there in the Quran's text.
The author specifically focuses on a 20th century theory that you might have heard of. It's called the miracle of 19. It was made famous by a biochemist named Rashad Khalifa, and his theory was that the entire Quran is built on this incredibly complex mathematical structure, all revolving around one single number.
And that's the number 19. For proponents of this theory, this is like a divine signature. They argue that everything, the number of chapters, the verses, the counts of specific words and letters is all intricately, mathematically based on multiples of 19. But the book presents what it calls a systematic takedown of this whole theory. The author argues that to make the math work, you have to, well, manipulate the data. For example, to get the total number of verses to be a multiple of 19, the theory's founder allegedly had to literally remove 2 verses from one chapter while adding in 112 unnumbered phrases from others. The author's point is that this pattern of cherry-picking data and even altering the text is a common thread through all the major claims. So after tackling these external claims about science and math, the author's analysis turns inward. The next step is to look at the Quran on its own terms, to see if it's internally consistent both in its text and in the moral framework it presents. Now, to really get what the author is arguing about contradictions, you have to know about this one key concept, abrogation.
This is a classical tool in Islamic scholarship for dealing with verses that seem to conflict. The idea is that a later revelation from God can actually cancel out or change the rules of an earlier one.
The book lays out examples like this one to show what abrogation looks like in practice. The author puts an early Meccan verse of tolerance, there is no compulsion in religion, right next to a later Medinan verse of warfare. The argument is that as the early Muslim community's situation changed, going from a persecuted minority to a powerful force, the revelations changed right along with it.
And the critique goes beyond just textual contradictions. The author also analyzes the character of God as depicted in the Quran. The book highlights concepts like istidraj, this idea that God sometimes deliberately misleads people as a sort of trick just to justify their later punishment, a concept the author finds deeply problematic from a universal moral standpoint.
All right, so after this deep dive into the science, the math, the internal contradictions, where does this all land? What is the book's final, ultimate conclusion about what the Quran actually is?
The author's final thesis is this, that the cumulative weight of the evidence points in one direction, that the Quran is a human document. The book argues it's a text that is deeply, fundamentally embedded in its time, reflecting the scientific knowledge, the literary traditions, and even the political and moral struggles of 7th century Arabia.
And that leaves us with one final and I think pretty profound question to think about. When you take a sacred text and place it under a purely historical microscope, like this author does that diminish its spiritual value? Does it challenge faith? Or for some, could it actually open up new ways to understand its meaning, to see a deeper, more human story inside? That's definitely something worth contemplating.